various types of events, how to deal with them. And after understanding and working with various events, we need to learn about how to handle custom events in Angular. And to work with custom events, first we need to know why we need custom events. So generally, why we need custom events. So how we can configure and work with the custom events and deal with them. Right. Yeah, it will not work. You have to try with a different scenario, right? You try. So what you can do. So if you cannot handle that, then later I will explain. Huh? Right. So generally, we need custom events. Why we need custom events actually? In order to deal with custom events, first you need to understand how to access a component inside another component. Actually, we are working with components. We are working with components. The intention of component is, so we design a component so that we can access and use that component in another component. We have a component, and index component, home component. In this, we have options like so login and register, like options we have. So when you have this register login, and when I click on login, for login we have a separate component. For login we have separate component. So we want this login component. We want this login component to come inside here. So that means a component must able to be accessed and used in another component. Generally, we can create the components to make them reusable across the application, so that from anywhere we can access and use it. So several functionalities are designed as components actually. Suppose, for example, I have to display some products data. That means I have some products data. So we have a lot of data. I want this product data in so many locations. We have a catalog. So we have grid. We have some list details. We have like index. Now everywhere we need this data. Everywhere we need this data. And wherever we need this data, I want some functionality for the data. Like I want pagination. I want filtering. I want sorting, like functionalities. And for example, we designed some content here. Means we designed a table here. In the table, we want to apply some filtering or pagination. Then I have to write the pagination related logic here. Pagination related logic here. Same pagination I need everywhere. Details, grid, catalog, everywhere. Then we don't write here. What we do is we design this pagination as a component, and we can link this component to other components. Wherever you need, you can link it. And very important is, so this pagination should able to, that pagination should able to interact with the data inside this grid, interact with the data inside that grid. This should able to interact with the data inside this details. So that means we want to reuse a component. In that case, this will have some functionality. I want this functionality to be used across every location also. So then what we do is we design our own component, and for those components, we design our own events. For example, one simple concept I will show you. Suppose we have a simple page. We said input type as date. If I say input type date, you can see a date picker came. Actually, it is not a control. Actually, it is a combination of several components combined into one control. That means actually, this is not one control. It is a combination of several things. It's a combination of several things. That means you should know that this usually contains. So let's see, actually this contains, this is a text box. That is a text box actually, that is a text box. And this is some icon here, that is some icon here. So that means some icon inside the text box. And when I click, I can have a click option. When I click, it will pop up a date calendar picker here. It will pop up a calendar. That means it is a dialog actually. It will pop up a dialog. In the dialog, if I choose anything, it will store that here. So it looks like very simple in appearance, but it has a lot of functionality inside. Now, this is not a control. It is a component with a combination of several controls and functionality. It is not just a control. So you say you cannot say that it is a date control. It is not a date control. It is a date component. So date time picker is a component. It's a combination of several things with effects, with events. Now this component can be used in other pages. Then that component should have a functionality, just like button have a click functionality. This component is having several functionalities, like icon click, like dialog select. So many options are there. When you choose any option in the dialog and say OK, then that value will be stored here. So a lot of functionality also designed here. That is what actually component means. So what you are doing now in Angular is learning. You are learning about components. That means actually you are learning about how to design components which we can reuse across pages. When you are reusing a component across pages, everywhere it should have its own functionality. Everywhere it must be defined with its own functionality, configure with its own functionality. So in that case, we need our own events. So here what we are going to understand, that means how we are going to understand what we are going to understand in this concept is actually, we will learn here. So how to access a component in another component. We will learn how the communication, to handle communication communication between components. That means we will learn about transporting data, transporting data from one component to another, You will see how we can transport data from one component to another. And we will see how do we define custom events for component. And we will see about the component life cycle hooks. That means various events used for the components. What are that? I will tell you. So that is, and we will also use how to use a component library provided by designing. You don't need to design everything. You have ready-made. You can import them, inject them into your application and use them, right? So that is the concept here. We are going to understand how we can handle this complete process. In interviews also, at experience level or at a fresher level, up to certain extent, they will ask you some questions. But at the experience level, this is the area where they mainly concentrate in interviews for experienced people. They will ask a lot of questions are there here to ask to you. They can complete the complete interview in just this topic for experienced people. They have a lot of questions to ask. You should know detailedly about that. We will see how this entire process works actually. Once one by one we will explore everything, then we will have a clarity on every topic that we are discussing here. So technically we are going to understand this in this context, right? First option is accessing a component in another component is very simple. You don't need much effort for that. So it's very simple how you can access a component in another component. So you can you can access any component and use in the current component by configuring its selector, by configuring its selector. You can access any component in another component by configuring its selector. That is the basic thing. It's a selector. Selector plays the key role here, right? That means it's a very simple option. For example, suppose we have a parent component. We have app. So parent, that is a parent component. So in this parent component, so we have app parent component. This is the parent component. So syntactically, so this is parent component. If you want to access any another component inside it, just you have to access its selector here, app child component. So then automatically its functionality will be added here. That means the functionality of child component is now available to the parent component. That's very simple. A single straightforward one option here. How you can access a component in another component. Simple thing. So I will show you here. For that, suppose I am designing. So let's open in the terminal. Right. So so let's create a component, ng generate component parent. So skip test. So I'm generating a parent component, and ng generate component child. I'm accessing the child component. Skip test. I'm designing two components here. So we have parent and child components configured here. Okay. Now let's go and set the parent component in the startup, and we configure that parent in the startup. So the parent component in the startup. So let's access and see. So the parent component is working. So the parent component is working. Yeah. So now let's go to the design, and here we will go to child component here, child component HTML, and here I will just keep a div. So and just I will add some effects into the div of the child component. So let's keep this class as container, and I will just put some background color, I will put a style, I will put padding as some 30 pixel. Okay. And we will put some background color, something like this. So we defined here. So background color, some green. Okay. Like this. So, and the text color, some white. So a color, some white. Okay. So these are the options I defined. Okay. That is actually the child component. And let's keep the text align to center. This is general, and I will just keep a heading here as child component. Okay, this is child component. We have some design. Okay, let's go to the parent component. In the parent component, I am designing the parent component. So div class as container fluid, and here just parent component. Okay, that is having a style, some background color, some light yellow, something like this. Okay, now you can see this is the parent component. So we have the parent component defined. We have the parent component. So I'm just adding some options into the parent component. Height, margin, some pixels we will define. Suppose this parent component is having margin. So margin as 20 pixel, and height as some 200 pixel. Okay. So you can see this is the parent component. So this is the parent component here. Yeah, this is the parent component. Now in this parent component, I want to access the child component. I want to access the child component and use it. So I want to access the child component inside the parent component and use it. Then if you are trying to access and use the child component in the parent component, then you can just define. So here you can just define the child component related helper here. That means selector here, app child. That's it. It is allowed to access any another component into the current component. So accessibility is simple. Currently, whatever the output of this child component is there, it will be rendered into this location. It will be rendered into that location. So that means it is working fine. That means it is accessing the child component and rendering into the parent components. That is quite simple. That's very simple. So up to this, everything is okay. So that means this is nothing complex because just you need a selector. Now the challenging which you will face in interviews and in general functionality also is, so now you have these components. So you have these components. Now the challenging part here is currently only presentation is there. The challenging part is how this component, parent component, can send data into this so that this component can use the data. How child component can send data to parent component so that it can use the data. This is the key concept here, actually. That means that is what the main point here is. Why? Because generally what happened is, suppose you have a home screen. Okay. In that you have a login screen. In that we have a login screen. In the login screen, you entered user ID and password and login. If user ID password is successful, then this login screen will disappear. But the login ID that you have mentioned, if it is successful, it will give that login ID into the home page. That it says that you logged in and now you can log off. You can log off. It will give that option. That means the data from this child component is transported to the parent component. From the parent component, data can be transported to the child component. There are two options here, how we can transport data from one component to another component. This is what important for us is. Generating a component is very simple. Generating a component is very simple. So how you can manage that is very simple. So that means generally we can use a selector. So it's very simple, straightforward option here to use. So that means the example is very simple. So add two components. So one component will be ng generate component, that is parent, and another will be ng generate component child. We are adding those two components there. Okay. Now after adding the components, so now we need to configure here the parent component, parent.component. First we will design the child.component.html. In child component HTML, we have to just add this design, just design currently. This is the child component design. So we are adding the child component design here. That is the design for the child component. Okay. That is the design. And we need one more, that is parent.component.html. In parent component, what we have to do is just we need to call that child component and use it by using app child. So this is the design. So for the parent component, that is the design for parent component. Here we are accessing the child. We are accessing the child. So this is a simple option. That means how you are managing that. It is a simple option. That means we are accessing a component in another component and you are using it. Up to presentation, there is no problem. But important is how you transport data from one component to another component. This is the challenging one. For this, you need some new options to understand. That means how transport data from parent to child. Parent to child. So parent is which is at the higher hierarchy. Child is in the lower hierarchy, inner, outer and inner, right? That's the option here. Transport data from parent to child. So if you have to transport data from parent to child, some rules are there. What are the rules actually? That means if you want to transport data from parent to child, first point. So child component must have a property to access the value coming from parent. First thing, child component must have a property to access the value coming from parent. That means to store the value coming from parent. Okay, so that means now that is the key point here. So let's go to the child component TS file. In the child component TS file, there must be a property here which can access the data and store from the parent. That means here we will put a property here. I will just put a property here as let's clean this up. Okay. Yeah. So here we will create a property messes. Okay. MSG is a property. This property we need to print in the child component. In the child component, we are printing that MSG here. So that means in a paragraph, I am printing that MSG here. MSG is currently empty. That means first option is satisfied. The first option is satisfied. That means child component is now having a property to store the value. Okay, and you can use that. That means you can use that property in child component HTML. You can use in child component HTML page that we are doing. Okay. But important is here the key point is any property you declared in any property you declared in a component is not accessible to other components. It is not accessible to other components. So that means any property you declared in a component is not accessible to other components. That means the property that you declared in a component is not accessible to other components. So actually it is local. And private for current component. That is the point actually. It is local and private for current component. It is not accessible to other components. That means, see, here we have message property. You can access it and use it in child component. Now child component have a property called MSG. Let's go to parent component. This is app child. This is the child component. And you declared a property for this component. We declared a property for this component. And what is that property? MSG. MSG is a property. MSG is a property for that component. Technically, MSG is a property for that particular component. Generally, if MSG is a property for that component, I am trying to access that through a property binding technique. MSG here, it's not available. That means the property you declared in this component, even you made it public. Or we learned one option, if you remembered, so export. So you cannot export that because already class is exporting. That means already it is exporting. So export means we already learned that it is accessible outside this module area. So already class is exporting, then you don't define this export. That means the property you declared is not accessible. The property is not accessible here. Then here comes important point is, so if you want any property, if you want any property to access values, to access and store values, from other components, to access and store values from other components, then you have to mark the property by using a directive, by using directive at the net input. This is important. By using the directive at the net input, it is a marker. Actually, there are so many markers. Already we know some markers, some other markers we will see. You have seen a marker at the net component. At the net component is a marker. It is used to mark components. We have at the net ng module. It is used to mark modules. So we have at the net input. So we have at the net. So we have at the net output. These are all markers. There are all various types of markers. So we have so many markers. We have at the net pipe. So we have so many markers. We will see them. Technically, so a component marker is used to mark the class as a component. A module marker is used to mark the class as a module. And a pipe component, a pipe directive marker is used to mark the class as a pipe. What is a pipe? You will learn next level. So technically, input is a marker actually, and input marker will mark the content in such a way. That means what is the purpose of here input marker? So at the net input marker will mark the property as global, will mark the property as global, so that it can be accessed from another component. And input refers to a property that can store data. Input refers to a property that can store data actually. Your intention is to collect and store the data, then you have to define input. Why it is called input? That means it allows you to input some value from another component and store the data. So that is input marker. So observe carefully, MSG is declared, but it is not accessible in the parent here. In the parent component, so through the child selector, we are trying to access that property. It says that cannot bind to MSG because it is not a property, known property of app child. It is not a known property of app child. So it says that, but app child so is having that property. It is using that property also, but parent is unable to use it because it is not accessible outside in another component. Then I will do one thing here. I will go to child component and mark this with the input directive. Mark this input directive. Input is a directive which is available in Angular core library. You have to import that input here. So we have to import that input directive from Angular core library. So that means you have to import. you have to import input directive from Angular core library. So you have to import from Angular core library. That means syntactically how we define here is syntactically we define in this way. I'm not giving all of them, just only one option here. So syntactically we configure in this way. So we need input. And we have a property to be marked with. That means we have a property to be marked with. So that means @input and property name. So is equal to some value. If you want, you can configure that. Access modifiers and all this. Then when I mark this as input, I marked it as input, this property marked as input. Then observe in parent component. So for this child selector, that is child component, I am using a property binding where MSG is available now. MSG is available. That means every component that you designed, it can have its own properties. How you configure the properties and mark the properties in such a way that they can be accessed. So you can access by using this technique. Now see here, this is expecting some value. It is expecting some value. And we have to pass a value into it. So it is a string type property. So, or what type of value you defined, it is that particular type. You can restrict. It is expecting a value. So to be passed. That means we have to pass value. So if you have a value in parent, you can pass the value. Suppose here, I'm directly defining something. Hello from parent. This is the message I'm giving. You cannot do that. Why? Because it is a property binding technique. It is expecting some dynamic value into it. You are not using any attribute binding. That means if I try to use here, so here I try to use here MSG, it is not available as an attribute. So attr.msg I'm using as an attribute, and here I'm using a binding expression, and here I'm writing some string. So hello, like this. It's not possible because it is not an attribute. That means interpolation is not supported because, so it is not actually the properties. We are not using any interpolation technique here. So now it is you're written like an attribute here. Hello, and hello from parent. I'm writing like this. Hello from parent. I'm writing like this. I'm configuring as an attribute. And you can see here. So the child component is printing the data, but it is not available because this is not an attribute. So this is not an attribute. This is a property. Then we use a property binding technique. In the property binding technique, we are sending some data into it. So some string type data into it. And you can see it says hello from parent. That means the data comes from there. You are passing data from parent component to the child. Remember, you can declare, so you can have a property in the parent, and in that you can keep some message. You can pass that message here. You can directly pass the data. From parent, you are sending some data here. And it is collecting the data and using it in the presentation here. So actually what we can do is in the parent component, we will create a property. So here we will create a property. So property is hello. And here we will display hello from parent component. So that message I have given. And this is hello. Hello contains hello from parent component. Here, so what we are doing in the HTML, instead of passing any hard-coded string, you can just put that hello here. That means whatever data is present in that, it will pass into the child component, and the child component can access and use that and show here, hello from parent. So that means anything you are passing into this, hello from parent, anything you are passing into this, and it will be sent there and it will be displayed there. So that means it is displaying that. You are transporting data from a parent component to the child component, passing data from parent to child. So that means you have some data in a parent component and you want to send it to child. It's not in one attempt. Lot of hierarchy is there. There must be a property inside the child component to access your data, right? It can be any type. So you can't ask such questions at this level now, because this is any type, and unless you pass some data into this, you know that it is any type. You can't still struck into the basic level of TypeScript concepts in the questions. Understood, Kundan? Right? So these, you know, the basic rule of TypeScript. At this level, you cannot talk like, will it accept string? Will it accept number? So at this level of Angular, so you crossed so many months of time now in understanding TypeScript and all. And you know that when you don't define anything, again, you can't go to beginning level. So this is any type by default. If it is any type by default, once you initialize the value, then it will restrict the value to that particular type. Otherwise, by default, it is any type. No need to explain every time, right? It is always any type. And if you want to restrict, you know explicitly how you can restrict the type. We can configure the type so that it will allow only the string type values into it. Right now, this message is a string. You cannot pass any another type. If you are not defining this, that is by default any type. That's a very basic thing now, right? At this level, you should know that, right? So what type of value I can pass, how we can pass, right? That should not be a question at this level of understanding of Angular, right? So this, already we know all the rules of data type and how they are defined, type inference, so many days we discussed. So the point is now one level is completed. That means you are transporting the data from the parent to child. You are transporting the data from parent to child. How data can be transported from child to parent? How it can be transported from child to parent? Now you cannot think in a reverse way, like in parent. So one option will be there, one property will be there. We mark it as input. From child, we can pass data to parent. It's not possible that in that way. Why? Because currently already you are accessing the child component in parent component. Then obviously, if you are, this is already a parent component, inside it you are using a child component. Then how you will send data from the child component to parent component again? So that means so many times, like, will you access here app parent here? So will you access app parent here? So that is not the concept, because if I access app parent, what happens now? That means when you access the app parent and you see here, so when you refresh here, when you access the app parent, so there is no change in this. Why? Because it's not at all allowed actually. Suppose I will inspect that. So I will inspect that. And you can see that. So currently in the elements, in the body section, app parent, in the content. So this is the child, app child, in that it contents here. And it is trying an app parent component. So app parent component is trying that app parent component is there defined, but its content is not accessed here. You have it, but it is not working there. It cannot render it because already you are in the parent component. You are in the parent component. So then the point is how you can access the data here, the process here. That means how we can send the data. This is not the right way. This is not the right way. This is not at all the way. So to send the data. So how you can handle this data now? Let's see. So that means for that we need one more complex thing. Okay, let's first put an example up to this now. let's put an example up to this now. That means how we can access the data and use the data. Then we will see how we can send the data from the child to parent, right? One simple example we will design and we will see how to configure it, right? So that means the properties, we have two options. Generally, emitting the values from the current, then you can use an output thing for that. Later, I will tell you output option. Currently, this example is first this basic example. What we done here actually is in a child component .ts. So we declared in the child component.ts. So we declared this property. We marked it as input. Only input is enough at this here. Okay. And the second, in that child component HTML, child component .html. So child component.html, what we are doing is, so we are printing that message with some presentation here. We are printing that message in the child component HTML. Okay. Now parent component should able to access that. So parent component should able to access it. So that means in parent component also, parent component .html. In the parent component, here we are declaring a property. You don't need to declare any property. You can directly send. Only that property I'm configuring there here. And this need to be sent in the HTML. So then, so parent dot component dot ts. So sorry, this is ts. Yeah. And this is HTML. In HTML, we need to present it. And we need to access that property in this way. And we have to use that property here. We need to access the property here. That is actually the hierarchy, how we can access and define this. That is actually input. Now, how you can transport data. So you can transport data by using, one component to another component, how you can do that from the parent to child. One real example also we will see. This is just syntactical example. Actually, input and output, you may be hearing for the first time, but if you are generally aware of HTML very detailedly, you know HTML very detailedly, the input and output markers are very common in HTML to handle input and output activities actually. So if you are very good in HTML, then this is not a new concept actually. Angular is using the markers input and output dynamically, but this is not actually the concept. The actual concept means this is not a new concept. It is already general thing in HTML actually. HTML have input and output markers to handle the data, send data outside, bring the data and use the data. We have that technique. For example, these are not new concepts, input and output, these are new concepts. So I will show you one simple example here. Suppose I am writing some logic here, some code here. I'm showing you that input and output parameters are not the new thing in general actually. For example, I am showing you a simple here example of a form. Okay, so form have an ID, some FRM demo, that is the ID. Okay, now inside this form, so inside the form, so we are having some options. Like we have number one, you have a text box, input type is equal to text and ID is equal to A. And name is also A. And here value is equal to some 50. That is the value. So that is N1. Okay, number one. So I will put a break N2 and it is having input type is equal to input type is equal to text, ID is equal to B, and the name is equal to B, and value is equal to some 30 something. Okay. So these are two options here, and we have a form with a submit button. So we have a form with submit button. So this is submit. So we have a submit button. Okay. Now, generally, the point here is whatever the values you configured there. So that means this is the option. This is general HTML actually. This is general HTML. Now, whatever the values you entered inside these text boxes, you have to collect the values and you have to perform some operation on the values. And you want to display the output of those values. That means output and input. How do we manage that actually? That means when user inputs a value, so configuring the value. So generally, what should happen here? You don't need to use the submit button and anything here. So means not even the events here. This is just having this option. Okay, as of now. Now what we can do is we want to display the output of these calculated and this here. Generally, so we have an option. So output, we have a control called output. We have an element, HTML have an element called output. Output is an element. Actually, the purpose of this output element is to emit value. Output is to emit value. Okay. For which form it should emit the value. So you have to define the form name, FRM demo. For form FRM demo, it should emit the value. Okay. So for which properties it should work? For which properties it should work? So that means output I defined as, so output I defined ID as X, means how you can access this emitter. Output is an emitter. Remember that point. It is an emitter. We can access this emitter by using X. So it is having a name X, ID X, and it should work for A plus B. It should work for A plus B. It should work for A plus B. Now, important is when you input values inside these text boxes, our form should collect those values. That means whatever you enter inside these text boxes, they should be accessed inside the form. Remember, now think them as components. Input is A is one component, B is one component. This data from these components must be passed into the form. That means form should use on input. That means when input happened, what should happen is it should collect the X value. That means X dot value. X dot value is equal to, X dot value is nothing but this is the emitter. X is the emitter output. On input, X dot value should be X dot value. It should be X dot value. So what should be the X dot value? The value of A plus the value of B. They are actually numbers. Then we use parsing technique. That means parse int, parse int here. A dot value, it will get A value plus parse int B dot value, it will get the B dot value. That means whatever the values that you are entering inside this text box components are taken on input. On input, the values are collected and they are emitted output by using output. Output is an emitter. I'm not using any explicit JavaScript here. So I am just using an output element of HTML to emit the value. So that means, remember, form is a component. It should emit a value which will be catched by output and present the value. Form should emit the value and the output should collect and use that value. That means it needs a emitter which can emit the value. When to emit the value? On input, it should emit the value. Now, when you do this, you can see here in the design, I'm entering some values. That means in the output, we need to display. In the output, we need to display. Suppose I am input the value, that means 40, and you see 40, 30, it will be 70, 40, 50, it will be 90. So when you input the value it emits that value. When the value emits, then it will collect the value and use that value here. So the concept of input and the concept of output is nothing new if you are great or good in HTML. So that means this is a general thing actually. That means how the components emit the values and how we use an output. Obviously, 99% majority of the people who know HTML, they don't know that HTML uses an on input method for form. It uses an emitter called output. That much level of HTML is very difficult at a fresher level because that is always not required at that level of learning, right? But during the experience levels, when you are dealing with very complex things, then this becomes very important at that particular situation. Like we need to emit security tokens. So in the browser, so when user inputs the forms, so when user inputs the value, you need to verify without any external scripts here. Here, one more important point is actually implicitly. So suppose this is, I'm using on a browser. So I'm using on a browser. Of course, some script is running in the background for it. Some script is running in the background for this to handle the operation. So I entered 60. Explicitly, I'm not using any JavaScript. I will go to the Chrome settings. Chrome settings. In Chrome settings, I will search for JavaScript settings. I will search for JavaScript settings, which is a client-side script. I will go to the client-side JavaScript settings, and JavaScript I will block. I blocked JavaScript on my browser and I refresh here. JavaScript is blocked and I am entering some value here. It's not working. That means in the background, it is using the script. So it is handling several functionalities in the background. JavaScript is blocked. It is not working. That means you don't conclude that it is general only HTML. Output is an HTML element. Output is an HTML element. Input is on input is an event, and this belongs to browser. And if browser blocks the JavaScript and it cannot transport the data, it cannot emit the data. So that means any kind of interactions requires JavaScript to be enabled, JavaScript to be configured. If JavaScript is allowed, again, I'm allowing JavaScript and refresh this. Now it can work fine. It can work fine. Right? That is what generally point is. That means the word input and output is not a new concept actually. So we use that input and output mechanism same in Angular for transporting the data. But here what we are using is we are using input as a marker so that it can accept the value. Now you want to send a value from the parent to child. You want to send the value from parent to child. If you want to send the value from parent to child, then usually you need an emitter, and that emitter is actually output. Output is an emitter. It is actually called as emitter. The purpose of this emitter is from the child component. What it will do is from the child component, it emits a value. Just like you can think like now this is like a form. Child component is a form. Whatever manipulations happened inside it, it should be emitted outside. It should be emitted outside. Then outside means the parent component can catch that emitted value and use the value. So then how child component can emit values? To emit values, the child component usually required to use an output marker. Through output marker, it can define the members. So it can define the members. Suppose sum out, so it can define the members. So these members are responsible for emitting a value from the child component so that parent component can catch and use it. So you need two important markers here. One input to accept the value, another output to emit the value. First, I will show you an example with input. This is not an example. This is just a syntax concept we discussed. And I will just give you that general HTML thing also I showed here. So just for your understanding that this is general HTML actually. This is general HTML. So this is an example of HTML input and output. So output components. So you can say input and output components actually. So this is an output component which emits the value and displays the value, gets from this location. This is a general HTML. Now we will design one example in our application. So, and in that example, we will implement this input and output in a real world example where you can use this correctly. So how do we emit the value? For that, why we need our custom events? How do we configure those custom events? That we will see in next session, right? Tomorrow, we will discuss about that. And tomorrow is important because if you miss tomorrow's session, then at least for 2 sessions, you can't understand what we are talking about, right? So better not to miss tomorrow's session, because if you miss tomorrow's session, you can't understand for 2 more sessions what we are exactly talking about. So you can't catch up. That's the reason, because our other examples depends on tomorrow's concept. So we will design one complete example tomorrow. Okay, right. Decorator is called as marker.